Welcome to the Association 100 podcast. The A100 podcast is an extension of our Association 100 bi-monthly newsletter that focuses on best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies and tactics that work in the world of associations. The podcast will feature meaningful conversations with association professionals across the country, taking a deeper dive into trending topics, offering insights that both inform and inspire.
Welcome to the A100 podcast today. I'm your host, Colleen Gallagher, and I'm really excited for this conversation where we're going to dive into some innovative approaches and initiatives the National Association of Architectural Registration Boards has taken. Our guest today will be NCARB CEO Mike Armstrong. Mike has been CEO since June of 2011, and prior to joining NCARB then, he held senior positions at the International Code Council, ICF International, FEMA, and the Colorado Governor's Office of Energy Conservation. In addition to leading NCARB, Mike currently serves on the executive board of the Federations of Associations of Regulatory Boards, and also on the board of Washington Architectural Foundation. Additionally, he's authored a number of articles for professional journals and provided testimony before committees of the U.S. Congress. He's also licensed to practice law in Colorado and before the U.S. Supreme Court. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to welcome Mike Armstrong. Mike, thanks so much for joining us on the A100 today.
Great to be here.
To kick us off, for our listeners who don't know NCARB, tell us a bit more about what your association does and who you serve.
Great. Thanks for that question because it is a little confusing. Many people may not realize that a number of professions that require a license receive licensure through state government. It's not something that's issued nationally. So there's no national entity government-wise that controls licensure. So we are a nonprofit that is a confederation of all the state and territorial licensing boards. And we were created to try to facilitate licensure uniformity and mobility across state and jurisdictional boundaries.
That's so interesting. And we've talked with people in different fields where they've had similar things, not in the same exact scenario, but therapists, for example, nurses, and trying to get that to go across state lines because it's so difficult to go state by state. So that's very valuable. And I can understand why your membership values what you do. I'd love to hear more about your leadership philosophy and how it's helped guide your approach, particularly when you think about the challenges that are faced with architectural registration today.
Sure. I think that we are in a climate where the public expects licensure to be guaranteed that their health, safety, and welfare is going to be protected, and that individuals who receive a license are qualified and competent to hold that license. At the same time, there have been legitimate criticisms over decades that regulation has become too burdensome, that it has created an economic barrier or a process barrier or an accessibility barrier for people from different backgrounds who might otherwise want to be in that cohort of professional licensees. So what we've been trying to do at NCARB during my tenure is to focus on the user, focus on what's really necessary. How can we streamline and still preserve rigor that fulfills the public expectation that their health, safety, welfare will be protected?
I love that perspective of addressing both issues. So you can't compromise in one area, but you have to make it better for the user. So that has to take a lot to meet both of those demands.
I think we have at our advantage, we have technology that can help us modernize how we deliver and score examinations. We have better ways today of measuring experience. And we also continue to advocate for educational paths that are relevant to practice, not just relevant to thinking, but relevant to practice. We've spent a lot of time listening to the user and also trying to understand the public perspective, because most of what we do is either governed by a statute that gets adopted by a state legislature, and most state legislators don't know anything about architectural practice, or it's a regulation that gets adopted by a state licensing board. But that board may also have people from other disciplines. Some state boards are multidisciplinary. They have public members. So we have to, I think, simplify how we deliver the regulatory toolkit in a way that makes sense, that's efficient, that delivers back to our members at the state and territorial government level what they need without creating unnecessary barriers or impediments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing that really interested me about NCARB's story was how you use data to make decisions, because I think for so many associations, they have all this data available now. With today's technology, you can just collect data on a million different things, but taking that next step of how do we use that data can be really difficult. So I'd love to hear about how you all have used your data to inform decisions and improve your services, and if there's anything specific that you can share around how that's worked well for you all.
We've intentionally dedicated a number of staff resources to data collection and data analysis. We also have a number of consultants we use that are involved in our examination, development, and delivery who can help measure data. So one of the things that we have started measuring over a number of years is the disparate impact of our programs on people based on gender and race. Um, I think it's fair to say that many licensed professions are grappling with some of the same issues of lack of diversity. And while the data can be somewhat concerning in terms of today's reality, it also gives us a place to start with making changes. For example, we've been studying exam pass-fail rate based on demographic data. And so we've taken that data and said, okay, what kind of unconscious bias exists in the way we write our exam questions, or the way that we make our exam available, or the way that we characterize experience requirements that has a white male bias to it? Everything from making sure that pronouns in our exam questions are gender neutral, to creating an opportunity for people who use English as a second language to have an extra time accommodation to finish the exam, to addressing the escalating cost of test prep materials by offering free practice exams to counter the cost burden that disproportionately lands on people from underrepresented groups, or changing the way people can submit experience beyond a time limit if they step out of the path to licensure because of life conditions, which disproportionately impact women. So there's a lot of things we can do with our administrative requirements that don't compromise or sacrifice rigor, but move us toward inclusion and being more agnostic or more neutral toward people from different groups.
I love everything about this approach. And what you said that really resonated with me is that there are so many other types of licensed professions that are facing these similar issues with diversity, with, in general, just a lot of professions that are having a workforce crisis right now. That's really well documented. And I think people do a lot of lip service to, oh, we need to be better, being more inclusive, and we need to think about how we can reach new groups. But you don't see a lot of action. And these are some really clear, concrete steps you all have taken to help drive some more of those people into this profession.
I think some people are afraid of public criticism, and I think we just have to face that and just be self-critical. We went ahead and published a few years ago data regarding pass-fail rates based on demographic categories. We were nervous about publishing it. We talked to a PR consultant about how to roll this out, but we felt it was better to be self-critical and transparent and indicate that we're willing to take on the criticism and explain what we can do and what we can't do, what's in our control, what's not in our control. And to our pleasant surprise, we were complimented publicly for showing enough courage to acknowledge the issue, which everyone suspected the issue already existed anyway. It wasn't as big of a revelation as people thought it was going to be. And then we were able to show in real time, we're making this change, we're making that change, we're making this change. So it's largely been, I think, worth the risk. And in my role, currently, I'm the president of the Federated Association of Regulatory Boards, which is a collection of all the NCARB type organizations for all the licensed and credentialed disciplines in the US. And I'm trying to use my presidency to encourage my colleagues. If they're not collecting that data, they should be collecting the data. And if they have the data, they need to just march out smartly, certainly have a good strategy so you don't feel like you're getting beat up or that you have to shut down But we all, as a community of regulators, need to be honest, need to tackle the issue, and need to share best practices on how we overcome the issue.
That's so great. And sharing best practices to overcome issues. I feel like that's what associations are built for.
That's Associations 101, right? Yeah.
Yes. So you talked about for those that don't have the data, encouraging them to go get it. What is the first step you can take? How do you collect that data if someone truly doesn't know how to start?
When we invite licensure candidates or NCARB record holders, which also include people who have a license to use the NCARB certificate as a credential for mobility across state boundaries and also in some foreign countries, we ask them to indicate gender and race. Some people don't think they should be asking that question. But if you explain why you need the data, that it's to help the organization overcome unconscious bias and institutional racism, most people will say, oh, great. If that's what it's for, yes, I want to share that information about myself. Now, once you have that data, then you better do something with it. And it's not just race and gender, it's age. And in our case, it's also size of firm that they work in. We're also looking at the fact that we should honor what we call multiple pathways to practice. Not everyone can afford to go to an accredited architecture school. And so a growing number of jurisdictions are saying that you can get extra experience in lieu of education. Or maybe you go to community college and you only have an associate degree. Or maybe in the case of architectural education, you get a bachelor's degree that's a pre-professional degree, and you don't go on to get an accredited master's degree. There are a variety of reasons why people don't follow a traditional path. And again, as we mature and become more sophisticated on how to use technology and how to measure competency, we are better positioned to acknowledge that everybody learns a little bit differently and everyone manifests their knowledge a little bit differently. One size does not fit all, and imposing a one path tradition based upon people who are in late career designing all the programs based on what they experienced when they were first going through licensure is not only outdated, but it's also biased. So we also have to, I think, as associations in the regulatory world, try to inform our key stakeholders and decision makers about why these other options do not sacrifice rigor, why these other options are an and, not an instead. And that if we're concerned about the future of our professions and the diversity of our professions and access to our professions, we have to change the way that we measure competency. We can't just continue the same traditions that have been in place for a century or more. At least that's my opinion. And I think the NCARB experience has demonstrated that we can do it differently.
That's spot on. And I feel like you all are really ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about alternate pathways. And that's going to come to a head for a lot of industries that aren't addressing what opportunities are there for people without a 4-year degree, because as college costs have just skyrocketed and it's become a huge conversation as of late. I think when I graduated, everyone was told you had to go get your college degree. It was just a must-have. And I do think there's finally a shift coming there that I think professions have to be ready for in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes. And I'm a product of a liberal arts education, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. And I think despite all the other options that we might be able to offer, the overwhelming majority of future architects are still going to go to school. I don't think that's going to change. But an additional cohort of individuals might enter the profession that might not otherwise be able to enter the profession. And that's better for the public. At the end of the day, the public that we serve, if they have professionals that they're working with that understand their needs as clients, the society that they serve, it makes the whole client to public relationship more valuable and more meaningful, and it reinforces the value of licensure. In some ways, I think that the public and politicians are more ready for these changes than the practitioner community is. It's really interesting because if you look at today's political landscape, it doesn't matter if you're left of center or right of center. Left of center seems to have a greater interest in inclusion, and right of center is concerned about how regulation can impede economic growth. It's a perfect storm. You get a bipartisan approach going around, I'm not going to say deregulation because I don't believe in that, but I think modernizing regulation, contemporizing regulation to use best available tools, best technology, more agility, more flexibility. You can still be rigorous and have options. You can still be a regulator and a facilitator. Those are not ideas that have to be opposite or in conflict. And I think it's too easy to default to a rigid approach. It's harder to think about a more multifaceted approach, but I think that's the world we live in, and that's what we have to try to do.
That's a really great perspective and viewpoint. And I think that will resonate with people who are struggling with our members are on both sides of the political aisle. How do we address this in a way that brings everyone together? And that's what associations really need to do right now,
Yeah.
because that's how we move forward and that's how we provide value for members. So I think that's an awesome way to look at it and something that associations can think through. How can we do this as well? So right now, technology in any type of things we do, it's obviously evolving really quickly in many professional fields, but also in architecture. So tell me how NCARB is leveraging technology to streamline your licensing processes, and are you seeing benefits and advancements for your members from this?
Back to testing for a moment. Before the pandemic, we were already talking to people in the testing industry about moving away from only offering our exam in a proctored setting in a physical test center, and whether the idea of remote proctoring was feasible. And for a long time, we felt it wasn't. But I would say a year or two before the pandemic, it was becoming increasingly clear that this was a possibility. Once we got to the pandemic and test centers were shut down, we accelerated the discussion and the pathway we were already on, and we launched remote proctoring as an option for examination delivery. And we have roughly 1/3 to 1/4 of our test takers are now taking the exam remotely. And quite frankly, for some people, that helps eliminate stress. The idea of going into a test center, being surrounded by other people under the same pressure cooker, for some people creates a psychological barrier that doesn't exist when you're doing it remotely at your office or in your home. Other people need to be in that environment to motivate them perform well on an exam. But that new technology also creates new challenges, because exam security now has to dip deeper into technological tools that protect the data bank as well as prevent cheating. So we have new algorithms and new ways of scanning people's eye contact and facial expressions and other body manifestations on camera that might indicate a pattern where they're actually looking at something else or not staying focused on what's on the screen, which has led in some cases to charging people with cheating on the exam. So technology is our friend, but it is also at the same time, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence, something we now have to pay closer attention to. And then on the AI side of the equation, in terms of how that's changing architectural practice, we have a futures collaborative that is hosting a series of conversations about how does the greater utilization of artificial intelligence impact the regulation of architectural practice in terms of how plans get developed, how they get submitted to code officials for inspection, how they get reviewed for code compliance, how the ability to utilize artificial intelligence might at a future date be fundamental to the competency to practice architecture. So we're just starting to have those conversations, but we're looking toward new tools to assess competency. For many years, all of us who are in the licensure world, we quote the 3 E's: education, experience, and examination. Perhaps there are other things besides those 3 E's that can be used to measure competence, or maybe there are variables on how those 3 E's are applied. We need to be open to looking at what other countries are doing, what other professions are doing. How can we add flexibility and customization to the licensure experience to best position people to demonstrate competency? It's about getting people in. It shouldn't be about keeping people out. At least that's my philosophy. And I think that's the philosophy my board of directors and my staff have, which I think for some people might be controversial.
But also seems like it would promote the growth of your industry. So,
It also promotes opportunity.
yes.
Right. I volunteer for a foundation that promotes architecture in the schools, K through 12. We have many school children who don't even really know what an architect does, have never met an architect. They don't even think about architecture as a career option. How do we socialize what the power of architecture is in terms of impacting a community and make it seem like it's a possibility that you might want to pursue as a future profession? If we don't start talking about the licensure process differently, and if we don't start making the process as inclusive as possible.
Absolutely. And I think going back to the conversations you all are starting around AI, I feel like that must be so valuable for your members because right now there's so much theory thrown out about how AI is going to change things or what's going to be done
Right.
differently. And I feel like members need their association to really help them navigate that and understand practically what is this going to do? Not in theory, but in real life, what do we think this will change? How will it change it? How can you be along for the ride and not left behind?
We have some commentators suggesting that AI means the end of certain profession. I think in our history, we see that whenever technology changes something, it also creates new opportunity. So it's more about how does one evolve now, not how does one keep their job. We want to apply that to the regulatory process because the future of the profession is something we're interested in, but it's not our core mission. Our core mission is protecting the public.
So, one thing I thought was interesting when I was looking into NCARB's background and what you've been working on was you made a really significant policy change last year by retiring a restrictive exam expiration policy. I want to dive into that. So, tell me more about it. How is the feedback going? What have the results been? Are you glad you did it?
Yes. So what you're referring to is that we had something that we had nicknamed the rolling clock, meaning that NCARB requires candidates for licensure to successfully pass several computer-based exams. Currently, it's 6. It used to be 7, and before that, it was 9. The rule was that you had to pass all of those exams within a 5-year period. And if any of the past exams were older than 5 years, they were invalidated and you had to start over. Looking back on the origins of that policy, which happened long before I came to NCARB, there was a time when examinations were delivered manually, what we call paper and pencil exams, where everyone gathers together once or twice a year in a big auditorium or whatever, and they all take the test. And given the backlog of exams and how long it was taking to score the exams and to store the exam results, it was somewhat of an administrative convenience to say that exams older than 5 years were invalidated. I think there is also perhaps a belief that somehow an exam that was delivered that's older than 5 years isn't relevant anymore because so many things have changed. That was then and this now. And so in looking at the data on who was getting invalidated, it was disproportionately impacting women. No surprise there. Stepping away from the licensure path, our society still imposes more burdens on women than men when children are born. And to a somewhat lesser degree, people of color who have unique socioeconomic stresses after school and expectations from family and other biases in the workplace that affect their abilities as breadwinners, which may cause them to pursue other types of work. And that disproportionate impact of the rolling clock, again, using that data, caused us to go back and say, okay, what could or should we have as a policy? And we consulted with a community that exam delivery people know about, psychometrician. These are people trained in the science of examination, writing, and delivery. And we asked them from a scientific perspective, what's the right way to address exam validity? And they said, your number 5 is really arbitrary. There isn't necessarily a lot of science to back that up. A better policy would be to allow all people who take the current iteration of the exam, and usually that any one version of our exam usually lasts for roughly 7 years or so. Take the current iteration and then also allow the immediate previous iteration. Let all past exams in both of those iterations to count. That would be a better policy. So our examination committee did the research and then made an initial proposal to our board of directors. Our board took it under advisement and then had a second run at this. And we determined in January of last year that we were ready to replace the rolling clock policy with this new exam validity policy. We then took several months. We did not announce our decision. We took several months because we wanted to prepare our 55 jurisdictional licensing board members for this change. And then subsequently in April, we made the announcement that we were moving away from that policy, but it still needed to be adopted by the 55 jurisdictions because everything we do is advisory in nature. So we were pleased that immediately an overwhelming majority of our licensing board said, okay, we're with you, we will adjust. We had a handful of jurisdictions that had a legislative or regulatory impediment that needed either a statutory change or a lengthier regulatory change that involved public comment. So we now have almost all 55. I think we have one jurisdiction, Illinois, that is still needing to pass some legislation. And we have one state that still is going through the public comment period, and I believe that's Idaho. But we're close to being done with everybody else. And 1 year into it, not everyone has chosen to come back who've been validated. We validated all the exams back to 2008, but we have some success stories of people who, once we revalidated those old exams, they were done. They didn't have to go back and take any more tests. They were qualified to apply for a license. And we've also had some people get back in that had given up. It's a little too early to tell yet how many people are going to take advantage of this policy change, but it also, I think, really helped our reputation with the greater candidate and architecture community that NCARB is willing to listen, willing to evolve and change and adjust when we have good data and good science to back up those decisions.
That's awesome. And I can't wait to check in with you guys in a year to see more feedback and how it's happening. But I think 2 things you said that really stood out to me. The first was how strategically you rolled it out. You knew in January, but you made sure to get that group of 55 understanding and on board and in line with what you plan to do. I think so often we can rush things out the door and not have a really strategically thought out communications plan or effort to make sure it works. And initiatives fail, not because they weren't right or good, because the right execution didn't happen. So I love that. And then I think the other piece is just being willing to adapt, but doing it based on data and doing the research and then taking what seems like a very common sense approach, but was created through smart thinking, through talking to the right people, through research, and making a change.
And I think that it's challenging sometimes because, so we have a regulatory function. There are other associations in the architecture space that have more of a membership function, an advocacy function on behalf of the profession. And I think on this is one example where the professional society in the architecture space also was voicing concerns about our policy, wasn't privy to our internal deliberations, was impatient with the fact that we were being intentionally deliberative and strategic. And was trying to get ahead of the issue in a way that wasn't really accurate in terms of what was happening behind the scenes. So you sometimes have to tolerate pressure and criticism to stay the course and do something that's going to be, at the end of the day, sustainable, because you've touched base with your base and made sure that your stakeholders, because at the end of the day, it's only the state licensing boards who can agree to do this. Nobody else has the authority to make them do anything. And without their buy-in, which had to be based on our research, our science, our data, it would have been an empty gesture. So I'm really happy that we've moved in this direction. And we're looking at other similar impediments in our program, largely based on time restriction. Back to philosophy, I think we're also trying to move away from what I call a parental philosophy, where we want to say, this is what's best for you, you youngsters, you people that are still in school or right out of school. We want to incentivize you to get it done fast. So we're going to penalize you by putting expiration date and creating deadlines and forcing you to get things done, which, as well-intentioned as it is, you can't have a process that is inclusive and flexible and contemporary and at the same time be parental. You can't do both of those things. And I think many of us in the regulatory community have been guilty of being, for the best of intentions, being overly parental. And so I think we've got to rethink the fact that let the marketplace decide how long or short it should take. Respect the decision-making process. Respect that there are competing priorities in one's life that may cause you to go faster or slower. There are other motivators to get people through the process that we don't have to artificially incentivize. And then, because then we create barriers. You create the incentive, but you also create a barrier at the same time. And so I think we have to back off of that philosophy, which is, again, a change in direction.
That's such a great observation and insight. I do love that. I want to shift gears and look forward for a minute here. What are some of those key goals and initiatives you guys are really focused on for the coming years?
We are working on a multi-year effort. We're saying it's 4 years, but maybe less, but maybe more, to reframe the licensure path. Meaning, as we start talking more publicly about multiple pathways, we also want to focus on what ways might we redesign the assessment process so that there will still be these elements of education and experience and examination in a future state. I like to use the analogy of a molecular model. The molecules might still be there, but they might be aligned in a different way than they are now. That might not be as familiar or as recognizable to people who are mid to late career. This is going to require lots of research, lots of tests and models. It's going to require lots of socialization and transparency. And we're not fooling ourselves. This will probably be a prolonged and difficult transition. I keep telling my staff, we're building a curve in the road. We're not abandoning the highway, but we're intentionally going to put a curve in the road here, and we're going to end up in this place rather than that place at a future date. We have task forces that are already working on this. We're continuing to collect data. We are working at our upcoming annual business meeting and then a summit we're having later this year with licensing board chairs and executives to start to surface some of these concepts. Probably the first big one will be, we will be asking our board in September to lock in a new competency framework, and we will build out our future design of licensure around these competencies. What are the basic things someone needs to be competent to do at the point of licensure, not after you get a license? There's so much that all of us learn after we get licensed. We shouldn't romanticize what we thought we knew when we first got a license. What do you really need to know at the moment that license is handed to you? Knowing you're likely to work in a firm, you're likely to work with more seasoned individuals, you're likely to be put in a specific niche area. that you're not going to have to manifest skill in a whole bunch of areas that are going to be necessary later on in your careers. We've got to be realistic. And we also have to include voices from different perspectives. We have to bring younger and newer architects into the conversation. We have to bring people in from small firms and large firms, from different geographic areas, from different life experiences, so that we don't have a single perspective or a bias on how we design these tools. So it's exciting. We have a great pipeline of over 400 volunteers that are quite diverse. We are hopeful that in future years, governors will be appointing people from a variety of backgrounds to serve on state boards who are the voting members of our organization. So all systems are focused on this.
That's awesome. It sounds like you all have a busy but exciting few years ahead. So
Yeah.
that's great. Before we let you go, we like to wrap up all of our podcasts with a just for fun lightning round so our listeners can get to know you personally a little bit. So tell us, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Southern California in a suburb next to Long Beach called Lakewood until I was 15. And then the family moved to the west suburbs of Denver, where I went to high school and college. And then I went back to Southern California for law school and then back to Denver until I moved to Washington, D.C. about 17 years ago.
That's great. Love that. Tell me, what is your go-to Starbucks order or morning drink routine?
If I go to Starbucks, I'll get a latte. If I'm in the office, it's just straight black coffee.
All right. If you won the lottery tomorrow, would you still work?
For a while.
Yes. That's a good answer. I like that. What's the last TV show you binge watched? Or if not TV, it could be a book too.
And I can't remember if this was a binge or if a new episode dropped every week, because I think I was catching up. Feud, Capote versus the Swans.
It's on my list.
Also the new look, Christian Dior and Coco Chanel after World War II. Those are two of them. And then I'm watching Palm Royale, but I think they just drop a new episode every week.
Nice. I love it. What's a food you can't live without?
Chips.
Very good. And finally, what is your bucket list travel destination?
I've been fortunate in this job to travel internationally a bit, and I never get tired of France and Italy. My partner and I, our next big goal is Greece.
Oh, nice. I've been to Greece once and I loved it. I actually ran a marathon there, so
Oh my
it was
goodness.
very fun.
We thought we were going to get to go this fall, and my schedule just isn't going to allow it, but we're trying to figure out, we aren't going to book a charter boat and go to all the islands. So we would need to be, I've been reading a lot on where to go and what time of year and all of that. So I'll be an expert by next year, I hope.
Doing your research. I love it. Awesome. Mike, this has been such a fun conversation and so interesting, insightful. I love hearing about what you guys have been doing and think it's an amazing model for so many other associations to follow. So appreciate your time and sharing your insights with the A100 today.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Association 100 podcast, brought to you by the A100 publishing team, powered by Onward and Upward Marketing and Communications. You can subscribe to the Association 100 podcast on Spotify so you'll never miss out, or listen via our website at theassociation100.com. Follow us for all the latest insights and trends impacting the world of associations. Thanks for tuning in.